Welcome to You Got Hope Science. I'm Hope, and you're about to learn some science. In today's lesson, we're going to look really closely at the leaf and how it exchanges carbon dioxide, water, and oxygen in a lot of detail. We have touched on this a little bit so far, but we're going to go in depth a little bit more and kind of support what I've already taught you. So before we do that, though, we're going to relook at photosynthesis and cellular respiration and how this really ties into the leaf. Okay, so photosynthesis is the reaction between carbon dioxide gas, water liquid, to produce oxygen gas and glucose. Now, we've talked about how and where all these things move about in terms of from the root or through the stomata. So we're going to do a quick review here. If I balance this, though, it's 6661. And the point of this is that this whole process will release energy at some point for the plant in order to do its processes. So when we talk about gas exchange, we have a gas here so far, which is the carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide has to enter the leaf because that's where photosynthesis happens. We want the gas coming into the plant as close to where the photosynthetic process happens. So the CO2 actually enters through the stomata in the leaf, or it could also be in a lenticle in the stem or in the bark of the plant. Now, some plants, some trees actually do photosynthesis in the trunk itself. So if you've ever been to somewhere warm like Palm Springs, you'll see some trees and they literally have a green trunk and there's lenticles on them, and it actually does photosynthesis right in the trunk. But most plants do it just in the green parts of the leaf. Now, the water, we know, this comes from the root system. In our previous lesson, we described how water moves into the root and then up to the leaf. So it goes root, stem, and then to the leaf. And this is all through the vascular bundle. And more particularly, this is going to be the xylem. Okay, so this comes up the xylem from the root, up the stem, into the leaf. And so now we have water there in the leaf. We have carbon dioxide in the leaf. And so now it can do photosynthesis. And then what would happen is the oxygen gas would leave through the stomata. And this is all happening just simply through diffusion. So this is why we taught, transfer of osmosis and diffusion and facilitated diffusion. And so we could explain how all of this stuff works. So eventually what happens is you have a higher concentration of oxygen inside the leaf than outside the leaf. So oxygen will naturally leave through the stomata where there is less oxygen. The sugars themselves, these would then be moved into the phloem, which is part of the vascular bundle, and this is moved around the plant for the plant to do all of its processes. This is the energy. The glucose actually ends up getting turned into adenosine triphosphate, ATP, which allows the plant to do a whole bunch of processes. Now, cellular respiration essentially is just this whole thing in reverse. So cellular respiration is the process of glucose, C6H12O6 solid, reacting with 6 oxygens. And this turns into CO2 gas plus H2O liquid. And this would be a 6 and a 6. Now, these two things here, the sugar and the oxygen, these would react within the mitochondria all over the plant. And this would release energy. Sorry, I have to make one quick change. Up here, this would be produce energy. I shouldn't say. So this would make energy. Okay. All right. So that's photosynthesis and that's cellular respiration. Cellular respiration happens all over the plant. Photosynthesis happens wherever you have chlorophyll or chloroplast. That's are generally green parts of the plant, especially the leaf. In some plants, it can be the stem or it can be the trunk if it's green. So the next thing we're going to look at is the 3 different types of tissues in a leaf. So if you haven't printed this out, or if you don't have the ability to print this out, I'm going to have to ask you to pause the video in a moment and copy it out as best as you can. I try to keep the diagram as simple as possible so that it's not too hard to draw. I have to add one part to it, so I'm going to add a vascular bundle on the side here. It's probably not this big based on the size, but I'm going to just have it like this. I'm going to use 2 different colors, one for xylem and one for phloem. So I'll call this the xylem, and we're going to add in, it doesn't matter what color it's in, and we're going to put that on here. Okay, and we're going to call that the phloem. So at this point, what I'd like you to do is copy this out if you haven't been able to print it. If you have been able to print it, I'm going to ask that you write very small as we go through the 3 different types of tissues. Pause the video now and copy it if you have not had the opportunity to do so. Okay, so I'm going to color coordinate this diagram in order for the notes to make better sense when you look back at them. And you're going to have to write small because we're going to have writing all over this page, and we might even go into one more page. But number 1, I'm going to do this in blue. The first type of tissue that we have is the dermal tissue. So the dermal tissue is on the outside. It's on the top, the bottom, etc. So the dermal tissue would include the cuticle, the upper epidermis, the lower epidermis, as well as the stomata pore, and what we would call the guard cells. So this cell here and this cell here would each be a guard cell. Two guard cells make up one stomata. Okay, so everything along the bottom, that is all going to be part of the dermal tissue, and we're going to talk about their functions right now. Okay, so starting with the cuticle is kind of the waxy film on the top of the leaf. And you'll notice, I'm sure you've picked up leaves and played with leaves before, when you look at the top, it seems a little bit more waxy, a little bit brighter of color than underneath, where it kind of seems a little bit more dull. The cuticle is a little bit thicker on top. It prevents water loss, and it also provides some protection. That's its main goal. And what you'll notice is you don't have stomata very often or frequently on the top of the leaf because that's where the sunlight is hitting, right? We have sunlight coming in like this. And the plant doesn't want to lose too much water through the top of the leaf and become dehydrated. So generally the stomata pores are mostly going to be on the bottom of the leaf where it's shaded from the top of the leaf. Okay, now the upper and lower epidermises, so I'm going to kind of lump them together in terms of what their functions are. They're really to provide support and structure to the leaf. They're generally densely packed together, okay? And that's their main goal. There's some photosynthesis that happens in there, but that's the main goal, okay? Now, in terms of guard cells, this is kind of a really big deal in terms of how they function in order for the plant to do photosynthesis. So they're a big deal, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about them here, okay? So the stomata is responsible for letting in CO2 and letting out water by transpiration, as well as oxygen gas. So how on earth do these things actually work? Okay, so how this actually happens is sunlight stimulates the leaf, and it basically causes the cells that neighbor the stomata to pump potassium into that cell. So the symbol for potassium is K. So this is the ion of potassium. So sunlight stimulates the plant. The plant says, okay, I've got sunlight. We're going to use active transport to move potassium ions into the guard cells. Okay, now once the potassium has gone into the guard cells, there's a higher concentration of potassium in the guard cells. And so what happens then is water osmosis into the guard cells, and giving them lots of Tuger pressure, which basically causes them to expand. This opens the stomata to let CO2 gas into the plant. Okay, so this makes sense. The only time that plants could do photosynthesis is when sunlight is present, water is present, and CO2 is present. So the stimulation of the sunlight on the leaf tells the neighboring cells of the stomata, put potassium into the guard cells. Then if there's enough water, water then will move by osmosis into the guard cells, causing them to have a lot of Tuger pressure and basically opening that stomata up. Now, if it has enough water and it has enough CO2, it can now do photosynthesis. So all of these things work together when there is enough of each type of thing for photosynthesis: sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. So the CO2 would then move in. Now, that's moving into the plant. After photosynthesis, there's a higher concentration of oxygen inside the plant. And so by diffusion, it just moves out of the plant because there's a higher concentration of oxygen inside of the plant. So this is where the gas is exchanged. So again, what happens is the sunlight hits the leaf, stimulates the cells pump potassium into the guard cells by active transport. Naturally, water osmosis is into those guard cells because there's a higher concentration of solutes in the guard cells than outside. That causes them to firm up and open. This allows the higher concentration of CO2 outside of the plant to move into the plant. The reason there's a low concentration of CO2 in the plant is because it's using it all up in photosynthesis. Also, there's now a higher concentration of oxygen inside of the leaf because it produced it in photosynthesis. So the oxygen naturally diffuses from high concentration in the leaf to outside of the leaf. So that's the dermal tissue of the leaf. And this is how gas is exchanged between the outside environment and the inside environment. The next type of tissue we're going to look at is called the ground tissue. So I'm going to do the ground tissue in black. Ground tissue. The ground tissue is just under the dermal tissue. So if I was to compare a human to a plant, the dermal tissue would be our skin, and the ground tissue would be the muscle underneath, okay? So the ground tissue is made up of two major parts, the palisade mesophyll cells and the spongy mesophyll cells, but we can just call them the spongy cells and the palisade cells. Now, the spongy cells are the ones that are more loosely packed on the bottom. If you'll notice, there's kind of gaps in between them here and here and here. They're smaller than the palisade cells. The palisade cells are really tightly packed and they're really vertical like this. The spongy cells are these ones down here where there's lots of air space for that specific reason. The spongy cells are less densely packed. In order to let gases exchange. They provide space for gases to move up into the palisade cells or out of the palisade cells. The reason why is the palisade cells are where most photosynthesis is done. Okay. There are a ton of chloroplasts in this area. Just tons of chloroplasts in this area. So in these palisade cells, they're super packed together. They're full of chloroplasts, which have chlorophyll in order to do photosynthesis. The spongy cells are just below them because that's where the gases enter the leaf and exit the leaf. So the spongy cells are really just to make room for gases to exchange, whereas the palisade cells are where the photosynthesis is done. They're packed full of chloroplasts in this area, and they're really densely packed because you want as much photosynthesis to happen as possible because the plant wants to produce as many sugars as they possibly can. The third type of tissue is called the vascular tissue. And the vascular tissue carries water and sugars around the plant. In this vascular bundle, it's responsible for moving those things around, just like our vascular system moves blood around our body. Okay, so this will be really kind of the spines and the lines you would see on a leaf when you look at a leaf in the light. Okay, so the vascular tissue is really going to be a vascular bundle, which is what we've drawn above. And the vascular bundle has both xylem cells and it has phloem cells. And again, the xylem are it's actually dead tissue. And it is responsible for moving water up the plant from the roots, where the phloem is really moving sugary water around the plant as its job. So stuff comes in the xylem and it goes out the phloem, and the vascular bundle is part of the vascular tissue, which is responsible for moving those solutions and that water around the plant to where it needs to go. So in summary, we have looked at cellular respiration and photosynthesis, which is the production of energy through carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. That's photosynthesis. Cellular respiration is the using of those sugars. and oxygen in order to produce energy for the plant, and it releases carbon dioxide and water. And we've looked at the 3 different tissues in the leaf and how they are responsible for carrying out those processes, as well as what are their functions. So I just want to do a brief little chart here to summarize those 3 tissues and the cells that make them up, because let's remember, cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up systems. So the 3 types were, number 1, dermal tissue. And the dermal tissue were made up of multiple types of cells, including cuticle cells, upper and lower epidermis, cells, guard cells, and when you combine 2 guard cells, they make a stoma or a stomata, which allow for CO2 to enter, oxygen to leave, and water to leave. Our next type of tissue was ground tissue. And there was 2 types of cells in this tissue. There were palisade cells and spongy cells. And the third type of tissue is called vascular tissue. And those would have xylem cells, which bring water up to the leaf. They have phloem cells, which move sugary water around the plant for it to use in cellular respiration. When you combine those cells, they're put inside of a vascular bundle. And the vascular bundle works together to pump everything where it needs to go. Thanks for watching You Got Hope Science. I hope you enjoyed the lesson.